I'm Brian O'Connell. Welcome to Rogers TV's Remembrance Day special. We're here at the National War Memorial in St. John's. We're going to tell you a little bit of history about the National War Memorial. We're going to introduce you to a noted author and historian, Gary Browne, and we're going to take you inside to one of the most iconic places in this area, known as the Crow's Nest Officers Club. All of that ahead on our Remembrance Day special here on Rogers TV. I'm Brian O'Connell, and welcome inside the historic Crow's Nest Officers Club in St. John's. And my special guest today for the Rogers TV Remembrance Day special is Gary Browne. Gary is an author, historian, and a proud member of the Royal Canadian Legion. Thanks for joining me today.
It's my honor, Brian. Thank you.
Gary, you've written extensively about the Royal Newfoundland Regiment and their exploits through the First World War. And one of the things that stands out in your book, Fallen Boy Soldiers, is the ages of the young men who fought through these campaigns. And some of these guys were just teenage children.
For sure. The youngest one I came across, Brian, was 14 years of age.
14?
Who lied. And there was approximately 272 boy soldiers that I refer to them, which would mean teenagers, who served with the Royal Newfoundland Regiment in World War I. So they were mere, like you said, almost children.
So it begs the question, how did they manage to enlist?
Well, when I first started the research into that in the early 80s, I had the same question, and through research, and one day I was at the rooms, well, it would have been the Colonial Building at the time, and I was going down through the attestation papers. When they sign up, they'd have to put all this stuff in, and usually the military would want to know everything. And as I was going down through, I noticed when it got to age, it said approximate age, and I knew then that they didn't want to officially ask them their age, so that would allow some, and most of them did, when they asked them their age, they'd say 18 or 19, they wouldn't be asked, but they were 14, 15, 16. And that's when I knew that they were looking for, I guess you'd use the term, bodies to fight, to put in a uniform to go into the trenches, and that was the whole, I guess, right across the world with the British Expeditionary Force for World War I, they needed people.
So it was the small colony of Newfoundland, really 250,000 people, and the governor of the day decided to raise a regiment. And that was an incredible undertaking because financially the old colony wasn't in the best of shape. And all of these young men, not only from town, but they came from all over the island and Labrador as well.
Yeah, and that's something we want to make sure we always get out, and I'm conscious of, Brian, is that it was a Newfoundland regiment and Labrador, not just the St. John's Regiment. So they came from everywhere, little tiny coves up to, including Labrador, Rigolette. They came from everywhere in our province, these young men.
And there was a rush to sign up.
Yes, there was. And unfortunately, a lot of them thought, as did the military higher-ups, thought that this war would only probably last a year. So it was almost like something that was a charade. They were going on a trip, a holiday, and it'll all be over in a year's time, and they'll be back home in Newfoundland. And of course, they were young and they hadn't seen much. Like there was, like I said, just teenagers. So there was a kind of we all sign up and go over together with our brothers and our uncles and things like that.
Gary, where did the regiment take its first loss?
First losses was at Gallipoli. And then, of course, which is called the Padre Nangle, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Nangle, whom I wrote the other book about. He termed it the Trail of the Caribou, and this is where it started, Brian, in Gallipoli, and went right on and then into Europe, France, and Belgium as the last part of the trail.
Now, let's just shift gears and talk about Padre Nangle, because he was a very big part of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. And we should note here that they weren't the Royal Newfoundland Regiment initially. It was afterwards they were given that designation.
That was correct. They were given a designation in the latter part of 1917 for the battles, especially they fought in Cambrai. But the king had given them, they call it the Prefix Royal. More so, it's not a title, it's a prefix, but that's when they had gotten that for their bravery and what they had done.
Now, Padre Nangle was with the regiment through all of these campaigns, and the war for him carried on after 1918, because he went back to France, and he was the one who negotiated with farmers, several, I guess a few hundred French farmers, to take over that land.
Yes, Padre Nangle was at first the Roman Catholic Padre of the regiment, and he joined shortly after the Battle of Beaumont-Hamel. He was trying to get in from the beginning, and they wouldn't take him because he was a priest, and they didn't need him. And he even went down to the recruiting officer and said that he was just wanted to be a young soldier. And when the governor found out this was no young soldier, this was a Catholic priest, but he did everything. And Brian, so from just after the Battle of Beaumont-Hamel, he stayed with our regiment right through. And then, during all the hard things he went through during the war, his war wasn't over. He came home, and the Newfoundland government asked him, would he go back as director of war graves, registration, inquiries, and exploit memorials. And he spent from that until 1926, when he finally, I guess, that ended it all for him.
And he left the priesthood.
Yes, he did in 1926, and which was, I always found astounding, ended up in Rhodesia.
Rhodesia. He raised a family?
Yes, he did, and I was very lucky in the last number of years to get to know some of them. A number of them have passed away since, but yeah, he was quite an individual, I can tell you.
Did they have, his family members, any awareness of the major role that he played in Newfoundland with the Royal Newfoundland Regiment?
Yes, they were very conscious and very proud, and oftentimes felt that, their dad's legacy wasn't given what it rightly deserved, and so that was one of the reasons also, Brian, I felt the same way. Going back, I said, who was this man? Why wasn't he given more prominence for what he had done? And vis-a-vis my book and the amount of time and research that I've put in on Lieutenant Colonel Nangle.
So both of those books, and you've also written about the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary, policing through Newfoundland during wartime.
Yeah, that was correct, Brian. My dad was a member, but that was during the Second War. And it was the book was called To Serve and Protect, and I wrote about the constabulary here, because we were the only police force, and they were basically the national police force of Newfoundland, because Newfoundland was its own dominion, as part of independent dominion, as part of the British Empire. So I wrote about the policing in the Second World War, which was quite a story also.
Gary, some very emotional stories in your books, and some of the men who were 28 years of age seen as older men, and the young boys looking up to them. But Fallen Boy Soldiers is an incredible read, and such a powerful book. And of course, the Soldier Priest book about Padre Nangle tells such wonderful stories about a very devout man who gave so much to this province. I'm Brian O'Connell. This is the Remembrance Day special on Rogers TV. We're going to talk some more with Gary. We're going to talk about the National War Memorial, which is in for some work, and we'll tell you about that. Plus, Margaret Morris is going to join us. Margaret is the former president and current treasurer of the Crow's Nest Officers Club in St. John's, and we'll talk about the history of the Crow's Nest, the people who called this place home, for want of a better word, during the Battle of the Atlantic. We'll do all of that when we come back here on Rogers TV's Remembrance Day special. I'm Brian O'Connell. We'll be back after this. Welcome back to Rogers TV Remembrance Day special. I'm Brian O'Connell with special guest Gary Browne. Gary is an author, a historian, and a proud member of the Royal Canadian Legion. He's written extensively about the Royal Newfoundland Regiment and its campaigns through the First World War. And something else that you're involved with is the National War Memorial, and we still call it the National War Memorial, right?
Yes, and it always was, Brian, because, as I said earlier, Newfoundland was its own independent dominion. So Canada has a unique privilege of having two National War Memorials, one in Ottawa and one here, because ours is a National War Memorial.
Now, before we talk about the plans for the National War Memorial, you were telling me about a great story about a young man named O'Brien and his loss during the First World War.
Yeah, one of the boy soldiers that I refer to in my book was young Michael O'Brien from up in Witless Bay, and he was a student boarder at St. Bonaventure's College just before the war started, and he wanted to join up, but he was way too young, and he kept at it, and eventually he did join up, and still only 16, I think it was, or 17, and went over to fight, and unfortunately he lost his life and has no known grave. But what really struck me, Brian, was in 2010, after my book came out, a young girl, Emma Dornan, who was a student at St. Bon's in grade 8, she read the book and read about Michael, and she took it on herself to do a tribute to Michael, and the link between her and him at St. Bon's, and how she felt, and could take you through him being at St. Bon's in the same classrooms, out on the sports field. And wow, I was so moved, and I said, this is what we want. We want our young people to find out about these boy soldiers, some who are younger or as young as them. And I was just so proud when Emma and I gave me the copy of it.
Gary, we talked earlier about the ages of the members of the regiment, and if you were 28 years of age, you were probably an old man. Or considered by the younger men to be an old man.
Well, you were in the regiment.
Yeah, and you told a story about a young fellow who looked up to an older soldier, and it was a very emotional story.
Yeah, it was the story of young Davy Carew from St. John's. So again, joined up way too young, lied about his age, and even dressed up in his brother's clothing to join up. And there was a number of Carews who joined the regiment, and he went, of course, to Gallipoli, and fought in Gallipoli. And Howard Moore, he was an older, in his late 20s, soldier with the regiment, and they were in Gallipoli. And young Davy said to him, "Can I sleep close to you tonight? I feel lonely." This was the day just before he was killed. And the next morning, he's in the trenches, and of course, he's only a kid, sure. And he stands up to do sort of, I guess, fix his uniform, and a sniper's bullet took him through the head. And just can you imagine this now, Brian? That same day, Howard Moore and the brothers of young Carew had to bury him under an oak tree. Their little brother. So I mean, but Brian, not just only my book, but the story of the regiment is full of emotional stories like that. And again, this is why we need to remember, commemorate, and never forget.
Gary, we talk about the National War Memorial, and there's a couple of things that people probably don't know about the memorial. There are a couple of trees down close to, of course, it's on King's Beach, what's known as King's Beach, right? A couple of trees there that I was unaware of this, and I guess a lot of people are, but just tell us a little bit about those.
Yeah, that was when we walked through the other day. There are two royal trees here, believe it or not. And in 1939, King George VI and Elizabeth I, which we always had known as Queen Mother, had visited St. John's, and they both had put a tree on each side of the memorial. And a lot of people didn't have any idea about the tree. Some did, but not very many.
So they were the trees that the Royal Highnesses planted?
Yes.
Incredible.
Yes, and they stand there, and they're very prolific, and they're outgrowing, and it's important, again, to show the significance of how important this memorial is.
And it is, and to that end, there's going to be some changes made. Well, I shouldn't say changes, because we're not going to change the memorial, but we're going to bring it back to a certain point in time?
Well, that's correct. And about 4.5 years ago, Brian, I was honored when Berkeley Lawrence, the command president of the Newfoundland and Labrador Command Legion, here approached me. He said, "Gary, I'm going to start off getting ready for the 2024 100th anniversary of the official unveiling of the War Memorial coming up in July 1, 2024. And he said, would you come on my committee? And Berkeley and I, for a number of years, was just the two of us getting ready, because there's so much to do. And then we moved forward on the I guess you would call it a restoration. And then shortly after that, there were some other big plans made by another past president of the Newfoundland Labrador Command, Frank Sullivan. And we can chat about that after, about the unknown soldier. But Berkeley set up the committee, and I was honored. And then in the last couple of years, we've had great meetings with government. I have to say, Premier Fiore's government and his ministers have been excellent with us, and have given us complete backing. And so now we're moving very closely to starting the operational working committees, because we got about a year and a half left, and there's a lot of work to do, but we're going to restore it without taking any away from any of the archival, and even the look is important, the ambience of it. We're not going to change it, but there's a lot of shrubbery that's not, it's impeding on the memorial. And needs to be taken. Some needs to come down. So all we're going to ask, and I'm sure Berkeley and I will be talking about it as we get closer to the date, is, but we're trying to tell people, don't get upset if you see diggers or a lot of movement from now until 2024 on the memorial. But the Royal Canadian Legion are known as the guardians of remembrance. Sure. And I can tell you, and I know through Berkeley and Frank and all the other Legion members, that there's no one going to do anything disrespectful to this National War Memorial, but we're going to be ready for that 100th anniversary in July 1st, 2024. And I think it's the initial parade on July 1st, 1924, when the memorial was opened by Field Marshal Earl Haig, and with standing next to him was Padre Nangle, of course. When that was opened, it was so important, and we want to try and recreate that parade. And I remember doing research, Brian, and one of the papers said there were over tens of thousands of people from all over Newfoundland along the parade route and down here at the memorial. So we've got a lot of, as the old saying goes, many miles to go before we sleep. But there's a committee and government, and like I said, Premier Fury has been great with us, and we're getting ready. So you will see a lot of movement in the next coming months.
And if you can quickly tell me about the repatriation that's going to happen.
Well, that's something, and I had wished that Frank Sullivan, whose idea was a proponent of this, but Frank saw what we were planning, Berkeley and I, and he came up with this wonderful, wonderful idea, which Padre Nangle had wanted to do, to bring the remains of an unknown soldier / warrior back to Newfoundland. And he had made plans in 1924, but it never came to fruition. But Frank took it upon himself, and the backing of the NL Command and the Dominion Command of the Legion, and we are moving towards that. And I'm sure in the next coming months, Frank will get a chance to talk to the people. And again, I sound like a broken record, I guess, but we met with Premier Fury, the three of us, Frank, Berkeley, and I, and told him about the memorial restoration, and Frank told him about his thoughts of the unknown soldier. And the Premier played a critical role in this coming to fruition for us.
All right. Gary Browne is an author, a historian, and a proud member of the Royal Canadian Legion, and a little bit about the National War Memorial, and of course his books about Padre Nangle and the fallen boy soldiers of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. I'm Brian O'Connell. When we come back, we're going to tell you a little bit of the history of the Crow's Nest Officers Club here in St. John's, with the current treasurer and past president Margaret Morris. So please stay with us. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back to Rogers TV Remembrance Day Special. Joining me is Margaret Morris, former president and current treasurer of the Crow's Nest Officers Club in St. John's. And the Crow's Nest just has so much history. And I still think there's a number of people who, first of all, don't know where it is, and secondly, don't know the entire story of the Crow's Nest. So let's start with the beginning. Where did it come from? Whose idea was this?
The vision for the Crow's Nest came from Captain Rollo Mengi. He was a senior naval officer in the wartime port city, and he was in charge of morale and training. And once it was realized that convoys needed escort, not just in coastal waters, but right across the Atlantic, that's when the Newfoundland Escort Force was established here in St. John's. And he realized that he understood the importance of personal relationships. And he realized if the convoy system is going to be efficient, effective, successful, the officers have to get to know each other. And it makes a difference. If you know the officer on the bridge of another ship, can you count on him to give you a straight answer? And most importantly, will he keep a cool head when things go off the rails? So that was one factor in the creation of this club. The other very important factor was post-traumatic stress. And even before the term was even coined or the condition officially recognized, he understood the importance of having a safe, secure room where these guys could talk it out without judgment, because everyone had experienced the same thing. So these guys could speak freely, openly, candidly. They didn't have to put on a brave face for friends or family or people who worked outside that environment. And that too, these guys had some tough calls. And I can't imagine leaving people in the water.
Yeah.
But there were times when they would just have to keep moving and leave people in the water. And I think those images would stay with you a long time.
So Menge managed to secure this location from whom?
Sir Leonard Outerbridge, veteran of World War I and a well-known prominent businessman, of course, went on to be Lieutenant Governor of the province. He owned it was part of the family business, I guess. His wife had a big role. Once Captain Menge identified the need, he and Lady Outerbridge scouted out a few locations around town. This had been the attic, the loft of one of their warehouses. It was the fireplace behind us that really sealed the deal, made for a nice cozy room. And for $1 a year and a peppercorn, the space was leased.
Was that peppercorn and $1 a year ever paid, do you know?
I don't know. We could have a few dollars owing there and a few peppercorns.
So opening night was a special night here.
It was. The room was still under renovations. Apparently Captain Menge used his own funds to stock the bar. I think that would be a showstopper for a career in today's Navy as a retired naval officer, encouraging drinking and bypassing proper financial protocols. But they were fighting a war. I'm sure they had bigger things to worry about than who financed the opening night stock here at the Crow's Nest. But the bar was just a couple planks across a couple sawhorses or barrels, some routine like that. And there were speeches. Anytime something new opens, there's speeches. So finally the speeches are over, the boys settle into drinking. They find a bag of carpenter tools, and they decide to have a contest. Who can drive a spike into the deck with the fewest number of blows? Well, the contest was won by the captain of the corvette Spikenard. Spikenard won the spike driving contest, rather poetic. And that was January 27th, 1942. On January 31st, Spikenard sailed. And on the night of February 10th, 11th, they were torpedoed off Iceland with a heavy loss of life. The captain and all the officers were lost, and a good many of the crew. There were only 8 survivors out of a crew of 65 or so. So they weren't the first Canadian ship torpedoed in World War II, not the first Canadian sailors drowned, but they were the first club members lost in the Battle of the Atlantic. So they're a special crew here. So where the spike got driven in the deck, we have a marker in the floor there. The original piece of flooring has been cut out, and it's put on one of the posts here.
There are so many amazing stories associated with the Crow's Nest, and not all are sad, because there were some pretty interesting characters who were members of the Crow's Nest here.
There were, and I admire these guys for keeping a sense of humor in some dark, dark days.
Was it Chumney?
Commander James Prentice, known as Chummy Prentice. How he got the name Chummy, I don't know. But he was actually he'd had a full career in the Navy, and he had retired. He came out of retirement for World War II. He had a good career in the Navy, but not outstanding. But it was as a trainer in World War II that he really made his mark. And he was a bit of an eccentric character. Apparently he used to wear a monocle, one single eyepiece. And he was loved by his crews. And so one day they're having divisions, a parade, the crew or ship's companies all formed up in front of him. And don't they all have these monocles? Well, he looks down at them, he gives his head a flick. Apparently his monocle goes up, does a somersault or two, comes back, lands right back in place. And he says to them, when you can do that, you can wear a monocle. Till then, they all come out.
Is it safe to say that the Crow's Nest is in possession of the largest collection of gun shield art from the Second World War?
Well, I believe that. I can't point evidence to support that.
But to the best of your knowledge?
To the best of my knowledge, certainly in Canada.
And just quickly talk about the gun shield art here, because it is amazing.
Yes, each piece, well, again, it was in the early days of the club. The fellows were scratching the name of their ship into the bulkhead and deckhead, to use nautical terms. And Captain Menge didn't want graffiti in the club. The room was rough, yes, it was an attic and all that, but he wanted to try and maintain a decorum appropriate to an officers' club, and that, of course, does not include graffiti. But so he said, he realized you may as well accept human nature as try and change it. People want to leave their mark. So that's when he decided each ship is given a portion of wall space to do what they want with. And each of these, they're very colorful, they're upbeat, they show a sense of humor. And again, keeping a sense of humor in some dark days, it's really admirable.
And some of these captains would go back to their ship and reappear the next day with their gun shield art.
That's right. In particular, the Trillium back there, they were on hand when Wetaskiwin's piece got presented. And apparently they said, well, we can do better than that. Legend has it they left their beer on the table, gives an indication of the urgency of the task at hand. They race back to the ship, paint theirs up. They're back the next day, paint still wet and tacky, and it actually goes on the wall.
Now, do you still get gun shield art from Canadian ships?
We do. The modern Navy has been presenting a gun shield to us. We just recently got one from Goose Bay.
And how big was that one?
Goose Bay was exceeded the limits that
It would
Captain
not be
Mingy.
Captain Mingy approved, would it?
No, it would, but we managed to find a place for it.
And there are so many different artifacts here at the Crow's Nest. We talked about Sir Leonard Outerbridge. You have his sword here and his miniatures, his medals, and you have Commander Stack's family presented the Crow's Nest recently with his sword, and that tells an interesting story as well.
Yes, that's a 75th anniversary of the Navy. These swords, there was a limited edition of them. And on one side, it has all the battles, the campaigns that the Royal Canadian Navy fought in World War II. And on the other side is all the ships that were lost.
And if you want to find out more about the Crow's Nest Officers Club and some of the artifacts, you can drop in, and visitors are welcome. Right?
Visitors are welcome.
And if you happen to run into Margaret, then she can bend your ear and tell you everything, well, just about everything to know about the Crow's Nest, including the periscope from U-190, which is also a pretty interesting piece of kit.
Yes, over in the corner there, the U-190 was off the south coast of Newfoundland when victory in Europe was declared, and it would. I'm compressing the story greatly, but it went on to be commissioned in the Canadian Navy as HMCS U-190,
Okay.
and served in the Canadian Navy for 2 years.
Well, you can find all of that history here, and as I said, if you happen to bump into Margaret here at the Crow's Nest, she'll fill you in on some of the great stories. And people say when you're at the Crow's Nest, even if you're alone, you're not alone, because you feel the presence and the history here, which is just incredible. You're watching Rogers TV's Remembrance Day special. I'm Browne O'Connell, and we'll be back after this. And that brings to a close our Remembrance Day special here on Rogers TV. We hope you've learned a lot about our National War Memorial and about the Crow's Nest Officers Club and the people who served and the people who made the ultimate sacrifice through 2 world wars, the Korean conflict and the war in Afghanistan. I'm Browne O'Connell. Thank you for watching.